For a $110 CPU, AMD's Ryzen 3 1200 is quite a contender. Howdy guys, Ponchato here, and today we're going to be benchmarking my Little Red build. Oh yeah, and I lied in my last video. In addition to Counter-Strike Global Offensive, Overwatch, and Rocket League, I'm also adding PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds to the benchmarking mix. If you haven't played PUBG yet, it's really fun. Other than those, I'll cover Battlefield 1, Deus Ex Mankind Divided, Just Cause 3, and GTA 5. Let's get to it. First up, Battlefield 1. At low settings, the Ryzen 3 1200 and GTX 1050 average just over 120 FPS, with 1% lows staying above 60. Bumping the settings up to medium drops the average to about 87 FPS, with the bare minimum keeping above 30. High and ultra settings don't quite reach 60 FPS, but never drop below 30, so if a more cinematic experience is what you're after, it's still quite playable. Next, CSGO. It's an esports title, so even a toaster can run it well, but for the ultra competitive out there, the benchmarks are important. Since the game averages almost 300 FPS even on the highest settings, I think 1% and 0.1% lows are a more apt comparison. On low settings, Little Red hits about 250 FPS at the slowest 1% and 165 at the slowest 0.1%. Medium drops those numbers by about 30 FPS each, and on high, you finally see a number below 120. The 0.1% lows reach down to 38 frames per second. Keep in mind that's 0.1% of frames. Out of 10 minutes of gameplay, that would be just over half a second of slow frames. Deus Ex Mankind Divided is next. Frankly, this game didn't work stupendously with the Ryzen 3 1200 and GTX 1050. On low settings, it averaged 48 FPS with dips into the low 30s, and once you hit medium, the game starts dipping below 30 FPS. It's perfectly playable on low and acceptable on medium, but if you want to play on high or above, it's going to get pretty choppy. Now, GTA 5. Unlike what I've experienced with other builds, this one actually doesn't stutter too much on low and medium settings. You don't have to max out the game for it to be playable. Low settings can be a little choppy with 0.1% lows hitting under 30 FPS, but again, stuttering is pretty rare. On medium settings, the game averages 74 FPS, and even on high, it still hits over 60 FPS average. For $500 in parts, that's not too shabby. Up next, Just Cause 3. Low and medium settings are almost identical with averages around 75 FPS and lows in the mid-30s. Maxed out, the game averages 45 FPS and dips into the low 20s. Not ideal. I'm trying to narrow down why there's such a large gap between the averages and lows in this game, and I'm pretty sure it's because it's so memory intensive. 16 GB of RAM may very well close that gap, but that's for another video. Overwatch is another esports title which presumably could run well on a graphing calculator. If you're looking to average 144 FPS plus on this build, medium settings will suit you well. If you're just using a 60Hz monitor, you can crank it all the way up to epic, and even in the absolute worst 0.1% of frames, still maintain very nearly 60 FPS. Personally, I just leave it on low so it never drops below 100 frames per second. PlayerUnknown's Battlegrounds, or PUBG for short, has taken the gaming and streaming industries by storm. It recently hit over 500,000 simultaneous players, temporarily outnumbering CSGO. That's no small feat. Since the game is still in early access, it goes through updates quite often and is far from optimized. Despite this, just as a personal anecdote, it's really fun. Anyway, let's look at the benchmarks. On very low settings, the game looks like a claymation, but runs pretty well. The average stays around 74 FPS, and 1% lows only drop down to 56. On low settings, the game averages just under 60 FPS and never drops below the mid-40s, which is about as low as you'd want to go in a game like this. Once you turn it up to medium, you really start to feel the grind. The average hovers near 50 FPS, but 1% lows drop down to 26 and 0.1% lows hit 17. High and ultra are pretty much out of the question because the game spends so much time below 30 FPS. Keep in mind, this game is going through constant updates, and these benchmarks were performed in early August of 2017. If you're watching this video later than that, the game will almost certainly have received optimization updates. Last but not least, since this game is basically crack, Rocket League. Being an esports title, optimization was a key aspect of its development. On low settings, the game averages nearly 400 frames per second and even in the worst case stays above 160 FPS. On medium, the results are a bit more tame with averages around 220 and the lowest lows just under 160 FPS. Don't let the graph mislead you. On high, the game still plays really well. It hits 125 FPS average, 1% lows at 76 FPS, and the lowest 0.1% at 35 FPS. Again, I want to remind everyone that 0.1% lows represent about half a second out of every 10 minutes of gameplay. More than anything, they indicate stuttering, but in this case I never noticed a single misstep while playing. It was mostly during the goal explosions that it slows down a little bit. So there you have it. The $500 Little Red with a Ryzen 3 1200 and GTX 1050 does a pretty dang good job in gaming. In fact, I think there's only one other processor that could compete at this price point, Intel's G4560. My comparison video between the Ryzen 3 1200 and G4560 is coming soon, so if you want to be notified right away, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell icon to hear about it as soon as it's up. Also, I'll be overclocking the 1200 and comparing it with stock clocks, so stay tuned for that video as well. Ryzen has a pretty good reputation for overclocking, so I'm excited to try it out. If you want to pick up any of the parts for this build, or you want to check out the build video, those are linked in the description below. So guys, if you liked this video, hit the like button. If you want to see more, hit subscribe, and if you have any questions on the Ryzen 3 1200, the games I benchmark, or the parts in this build, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, I hope I helped, and I'll see you in the next video.